Well, you know, if you look back at history, you will find that there are not many who could compare to a girl turned queen like Esther. But maybe the closest that we could find would be the famous Egyptian queen, you probably have heard her name, Cleopatra. Like Esther, Cleopatra rose to power with foreign blood. This was kind of interesting to me that she was also part foreign. She was actually Greek. Her attractiveness, of course, gained the attention of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, rather infamously. Roman historian Plutarch observed how conversation with Cleopatra had an irresistible charm to it, and her presence, combined with the persuasiveness of her discourse and the character which was somehow diffused about her behavior, had something stimulating about it. She was a queen, Cleopatra was, in every sense of the word. Egyptologist Joyce Tilsley has found that she was very intelligent. One example is the way that she manipulated Egyptian religion so that she was seen as a living embodiment of the goddess Isis, which allowed her to totally confirm her position. And I believe truly, and as we go into chapter 5, I believe it was confirmed this week, that Esther was a very highly intelligent young lady. Both she and Cleopatra used their intelligence to manipulate. But whereas Cleopatra's manipulation became her downfall at the hands of the Roman Octavian, and that's a story for another time, Esther's manipulation, however, is shown to be noble, even wise. And it is because her manipulation was not driven towards herself. It was driven by fear of the Lord, and therefore it was the greater. But let's see for ourselves. I don't want to just say that to you. Let's see this for ourselves as we look again at Esther chapter 5. And I'm beginning this morning at verse 3. We pick it up. Of course, you remember that the king had brought this gold scepter and pointed it at her. Verse 3, then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. This is the word of the Lord. And the message, brothers and sisters, this morning is that in a world that is full of pride, God guides those who seek his wisdom. In a world that is full of pride, God guides those who seek his greater wisdom. Well, similar to Herod Antipas, King Xerxes offers Esther a request. Now, what a relief it must have been, right? I mean, maybe you can think back a week, and of course, that's the beauty of a story like this, is that they are really woven together. But what a sense of relief for Esther when the king extended that golden scepter. 3 days of fasting and praying now the miracle as Esther's life is spared. But Esther and the Jews are far from the clear. Because it's one thing to go before the king illegally and certainly against Persian law. Telling the king, however, that his most trusted advisor was a crook is another matter. This is not over yet. The king's first words to Esther upon sparing her life are rather interesting words. He asks her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." Now, we should not overlook, we should not miss that for the first time in the book of Esther, the king actually acknowledges Esther as a queen. It's the first time that we see him say Queen Esther. And I think I go back to last week, and one of the things that Esther did that was kind of subtle but very wise is that she put on royalty before she made an appearance. And it paid off. It was a wise choice to put on royalty, not only in her appearance, but in her attitude, in her way, in her manner. But even more noticeable is this fascinating offer that Xerxes makes to her. And it's something I found myself focusing on some, which is this phrase, "up to half the kingdom." It's the same phrase that he actually repeats in verse 6. Is he really offering her up to half of the massive Persian Empire? I mean, you remember maybe from the first week how massive the Persian Empire was at this time. Now, that would be something, but that's not actually what is being said here. Rather, this phrase was what you would call an ancient idiom. You know, we use idioms like turn of phrase that helps us to kind of give a visual for what we mean. And it was used to express satisfaction. It's to earn the generosity of someone greater. Interestingly enough, we see the exact same phrase, the same idiom used by Herod Antipas in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. And I'm going to read this because it's really fascinating, these similarities. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom." So if you pay close attention to these two stories, you see that there are a number of similarities. In both of these instances, pagan royalty offered generous requests to two young, beautiful women, both at banquets. And in both Herod and in Xerxes, we find what but immoral, drunken buffoons who are in power. And now that's the fact. But of course the question would be, what else is there? Maybe what are we supposed to take from the similarities in these two texts? What is the author trying to reveal here? I think it is this. It is this, that we can draw confidence in beholding the prevailing providence of our God. We have spoken, haven't we, on the providence of God. It is certainly a theme interwoven throughout this book. But I think particularly right here, we should not look, and I think the author wants us to see this, we should not look at Xerxes as in any way the hero of the story. No, he is not the hero, nor is Herod a hero. They do not draw our praise. Yet in both instances, when the phrase "up to half the kingdom" is used, the sovereign plan of God unfolds in both of these through loss. John the Baptist would tragically die in the aftermath of Herod's banquet, but in his death brought forth the ministry of Jesus Christ. In Xerxes' case, the request would eventually lead to the downfall of Haman. And what I think we should see most of all is that God is in control. God is in control. No matter what the powers of our world can produce, God is always in control. There's nothing Haman, nothing Xerxes, nothing Herod can do to thwart God's providential plan. And so, attentive to the will of God, Esther invites a second banquet. Now, in case it has not become apparent yet in our study of the book of Esther together, and I really wanted to kind of highlight this from even chapter 1 of the book of Esther, you might have noticed how Persian culture was big on banquets. Have you noticed that? It kind of keeps coming up, these banquets, right? They're big on banquets. Well, this was really interesting to me that just not that long ago, really, in 1971, the Persian Empire, which was really at the time Iran, celebrated its 2,500th birthday as Shah Reza Pahlavi of Iran gave a 4-day celebration costing nearly $100 million. Now, the focal point of the event was this huge banquet, of course. The banquet hall being a gigantic silk tent lighted with, this is unbelievable, $840,000 worth of colored lights. That's just something. The guest list matched the occasion. The Shah invited more than 600 dignitaries from over 60 nations. And that must have been a sight to see, right? I mean, obviously, this culture really valued the banquet. Now, that is interesting because what does Esther choose? And there's this kind of link. Esther is aware of Persian culture, right? She has grown up in Persia. She's aware, and so what does she do? She invites the king to a banquet. In verse 4, we learn that Haman is also invited to this banquet. Now, while Haman's invitation may seem like a trivial side detail, okay, Haman's invited, that's not a big deal. Well, actually, in that time and in that culture, it was actually exceptionally rare for anyone to banquet with the king. Haman had good reason to feel honored by this invitation. But we shouldn't mistake this for equal treatment either. Persian writings indicate that during such occasions, those rare occasions, when someone would accompany the king would have reclined on a couch that was made of gold, sipping the red wine of Hebron. The guests, however, would drink an inferior beverage while they were seated on the floor. So I guess in my mind, when I thought of this banquet, I always thought of the two of them kind of hanging out together as more equals. Oh no. No, the king was on a totally different level than Haman. Kind of adds meaning to the idea of eating out of one's hand, if you think about it. Well, at some point during the banquet, King Xerxes recalled Esther's unannounced visit, and he sought out the reason for it. He knew, of course he knew, that what Esther had done by going before him in that inner court was an illegal thing to do. Something significant must have provoked Esther to take that risk. She had risked her life. Certainly there was a reason for it. And so I think if you've been me, if you read this the way I do, I came rather expectantly for the first time to verses 6 to 8. The king asks her, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to, again, half the kingdom. It will be granted." Of course, then we're waiting. Okay, this is the time, right? Esther's going to say something. Esther replies, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." As the reader, we know what Esther must do, right? We've been waiting for Esther to say the big deal, to reveal the hidden plot of Haman. We've been on pins and needles, waiting to hear what Esther will say. But instead of what we expect her to say here, she invites the king, she invites Haman to a second banquet. If this was TV drama, I think we'd be on edge. What's going on? In seeking to justify Esther, I've heard, even in sermons sometimes, the answer that she was using a delay tactic because she was afraid. And that would be understandable, but actually a closer look suggests a different answer. Because in point of fact, Esther was following Persian protocol. She was following Persian protocol for presenting a request. She begins by asking for a small favor in order to get to the real issue at hand. And really, just to show you this, verse 8 is the key. Because she responds with very intentional words to the king. Her wording is quite revealing. Because she asks in a conditional, "If it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then." You see what she's doing? You see that? It's subtle. She is obliging the king. If you're going to come to a second banquet, then grant my petition now. Grant what I'm asking for now. The first banquet, then, is setting up what the second banquet is now guaranteed to deliver. What wisdom! I mean, that is really, really wise of Esther, to be aware and, in a sense, to put the king in a difficult place of basically guaranteeing the life of Haman beforehand. And so the man who thinks that he's got it made, Haman, has another thing coming. Under his nose, right there at that first banquet, Esther schemes the deliverance of God's people. What wonderful wisdom. In encountering Mordecai, then, we see that Haman's pride escalates. What we have observed so far is God's work, drawing together Esther, King Xerxes, and Haman at these banquets for a higher purpose. Esther, for her part, has shown wisdom as she is circumventing Persian power. She does not know the depth of loyalty that exists between Haman and King Xerxes. She does not know the end result. She doesn't know what the end will bring, but she is living and she is moving from the throne onwards with a great deal of precision, and she is calculated in what she's doing. She is what we see described in Proverbs 31, verse 25. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come, and she will be able to laugh. Oh, yes. And I ask you, ladies of Putnam, does this describe you, clothed with strength and dignity? How are you navigating your time, your priorities, your place in God's plan? You see, wisdom is an essential virtue in a world full of pride. God blesses those who seek his wisdom. In the spirit of Proverbs 14:16, one who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. And so how appropriate that we would turn our focus now to the story's fool. Because despite being rather small potatoes, Haman thought himself the top banana. I couldn't help myself. We can imagine him walking home late that night, rather tipsy, thinking, I've got King Xerxes to do my bidding. I've got Queen Esther inviting me to these banquets. I've got the royalty of Persia wrapped around my finger. What could possibly go wrong for me? I'm sure Haman was very happy and in high spirits. Imagine yourself in such power and such control. And then, of course, he runs again into Mordecai. And once again, Mordecai doesn't pay him respect. In fact, in verse 9, we read, Mordecai neither rose nor showed fear. And I have to imagine that the second part there was what really bothers Haman. No fear. You see, Mordecai is a man who trusts in God. And again, we see his character right there. He's a man who trusts in God's providence. He's not afraid of Haman. He has fear of the Lord, and that's where it should be. Haman wants him to be afraid. Haman wants him to be terrified, but he's not. Now, if you can recall, this is many weeks ago, recall, if you will, Haman's response after he learns that Haman has not been bowing to him. The answer is in Esther chapter 3. We learn that Haman's first response is he was enraged. That word enraged is key. The same Hebrew is used here. The same response. And this is not just being upset. It's not just being annoyed. This is a murderous, all-consuming wrath. His first reaction when he sees Mordecai is to immediately want to murder him. He is fuming in his anger. The problem, for at least for Haman, is that he's already established an edict that has already determined that Mordecai and the Jewish people will perish. And why, then, we ask, does Mordecai continue to get under his skin? I mean, right? Think about it. He already has determined an edict. He's already set in motion that Mordecai will not live for long. His days are numbered. Why is it that Mordecai is under his skin? And the answer is obvious, isn't it? It's pride. It's pride. It's confirmed as soon as Haman gets home. You can see this pride for your very own selves. Look at what Haman does when he gets home. I'm going to kind of emphasize certain words here. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And then he continues, I am the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet. We ask, is Haman really a fool? Proverbs 14:3 teaches us, a fool's mouth lashes out with pride. A fool's mouth lashes out with pride. Isn't that what we are seeing right here? Isn't that what we are seeing out of Haman himself? I mean, if you take the time, emphasize the pronouns, you know that this man can only think about himself. This man is infatuated with himself. No acknowledgement of what has actually made all of this possible. No, he's a man who is totally idolizing himself. And you know what? There's as much pride here and today as there ever was. Instead of doing what we are being led to do, oftentimes we only do what we want to do. Instead of asking, how are you? We go straight into the realm of me, myself, and I. And you say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, you see, brothers and sisters, when everything is about me, not only do I fail to notice the needs and the cares of others and therefore fail to love them, but I end up creating division and ultimately destruction. A heart of foolish pride says, all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. And there, right there, is the very heart of pride. No satisfaction, right? Because instead of being a content person, pride makes a person of contempt. Do you hear the difference? You cannot be content when you have pride. Why? Because there's never enough. You are never going to meet expectations. The person who is pride and who has pride at the heart of who they are never satisfied by what they have gotten, what they see of others, right? There's always something more. This is especially felt by those in close proximity. You might recall how Jesus was on the receiving end of contempt by his own biological family. I'm reminded of these words, that familiarity breeds contempt when pride rules the heart. That comes from John Bloom. Don't believe that pride leads to destruction? Well, look at what Haman's wife Zeresh recommends. Look at Haman's wife. Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of literally 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. They knew full well that Jews regarded anyone killed on a tree as cursed. And so she advises, let's put Mordecai on not just a pole, 75-foot tree to die for all of Susa to see. And so on a worldly level, we close the chapter, Esther 5, in a very sinister situation. Mordecai's life is in desperate peril. And I think it's also kind of humorous, isn't it? The irony. Remember way back with Queen Vashti, what was the issue? The lack of respect, right? And the men there who had gathered, they said, well, we want to be in charge of our households, and yet we see the irony right here. Zeresh is very much in charge of that household. There's such irony there. But ultimately, and when I thought of that tree, when I think of that curse, don't we go to the cross? Don't we go to the cross on Calvary? For the tree that cursed the Jews was the very tree that Jesus took on your behalf and mine. And what was it that caused that? Our pride, our sins. They led to that destruction, the death of the Son of Man. We need no look further than the cross to see where our pride goes. But the very worst of us cannot thwart the powerful redeeming plan of our God. And so, brothers and sisters, we look to the cross and we say, yes, it was my sin that put him there, but very much so the same truth applies, that our hope today is the same hope on Easter Sunday. And that is, as soon as we go to the cross, it's important that we also go to what? The empty tomb. That Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus is victorious. And when we look at this world and we see the sadness and the brokenness and the loneliness and the tiredness of it all. And when we look at this virus that is once again on the rise, where should we go, brothers and sisters? We go to Easter. We go to Sunday morning when Jesus rose again. If Jesus has the power over death, brothers and sisters, he has the power in your life. He has that power to redeem your life for a higher plane. And so in a world that is full of pride, God guides those who seek his wisdom. Theologian J.I. Packer has provided, I believe, personally, the best definition of wisdom in his book, Knowing God. Wisdom, he wrote, is the power to see and the inclination to choose the best and highest goal, together with the surest means of attaining it. And isn't that Esther? Right? She's looking at the goal, and she's calculating all that's going on and how to get there the best. It is, if you will, spiritually opportunistic. Esther saw, with wisdom, it was not the best decision to name Haman, to name the plot in the inner court of the king. And so she discerned also that the first banquet was not the right time. Instead, she chose a very interesting day. She chose the 17th of Nisan as the day to expose Haman, the second banquet. And if that day doesn't ring something in your memory bank, it is the same historic day when God destroyed Pharaoh and the army of Egypt in pursuit of Israel and Moses. That's pretty neat. How God wove those stories in such a beautiful, powerful way. God's justice, God's providence. How did Esther discern such wisdom? How did she see with such spiritual eyes that that is what God was doing? I believe she asked God. I believe she was in tune with the Spirit of God, who offers us these same words. I want you to listen to this as a letter spoken from God to you. I discovered this and found great encouragement from it. Listen to these as a letter from God to you. My precious child, I am in control. I am sovereign. I am able to make things happen the way I want them to go. Yes, I allow you to make your own choices. And I know you don't fully understand how these ideas can operate side by side. But I'm able to work within and around the choices you make to cause my ultimate purposes to succeed. For this, you must trust me. Ask me about your choices. Ask me about your plans. My wisdom is yours, if you'll only ask. Lovingly, your Heavenly Father, the King. You hear those words? How do we navigate these times, these difficult, challenging, and turbulent times? Ask God. Ask God for wisdom, and he who is very generous and gracious to all of us will give it in abundance. Let us pray.